The Arizona sun is a merciless god, and in its unforgiving glare, judgment is often swift and brutal. For the Apache warrior known as Taza Judgment came not with a rope or a bullet, but with rawhide strips binding him to a dying mesquite tree. His sentence, declared by a man who appointed himself judge and jury, was to be a feast for the scavengers of the Sonoran desert, a slow, agonizing return to the dust. For 2 days he endured. The sun flayed his skin, thirst cracked his soul, and the circling vultures overhead were a patient waiting jury. But his salvation wouldn't come from a posse or a priest. It would come from the single crack of a rifle fired by the one person in that entire territory who had every reason on earth to let him die. The heat was a physical thing, a solid wall that pressed in from all sides. It shimmered above the baked caliche soil, distorting the distant mesas into drunken, wavering shapes. For the man tied to the mesquite tree, the world had been reduced to 3 torturous certainties: the fire in the sky, the fire in his throat, and the biting grip of the rawhide on his wrists. His name was Taza. He was Chiricahua Apache, a man whose people knew this land not as a territory to be conquered, but as a mother to be respected. He had been tracking a party of 3 white men, Nakai Yes, who had stolen a half-dozen prize mares from his band. He was not a raider. He was a retriever, a shepherd to his people's wealth. His pursuit had been patient, skillful, a ghost moving through the canyons and arroyos. But his skill had not accounted for a second group of white men, a larger one led by a man whose eyes held the cold, dead light of a frozen star. That man was Cain. Cain was a rancher whose holdings grew like a cancer on the land, choking out smaller homesteaders and Apache alike. He rode with 12 men, all of them bearing the same hard, bitten look, as if their faces had been chiseled from the surrounding rock by pure spite. They'd found Taza, watering his pony at a hidden spring, the stolen mares not yet recovered, but their tracks fresh. For Cain, an Apache warrior, so deep in his territory, was guilt incarnate. There was no trial. There was only Cain's booming voice, thick with contempt. Horse thief and murderer, he'd declared, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice that sizzled on a hot rock near Taza's feet. We don't hang your kind. Hanging's too quick. We give you back to the earth you claim to love so much. His men had laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that the canyons threw back at them. They'd dragged Taza from his pony, ignoring his stoic silence, a silence they mistook for arrogance rather than defiance. They chose the mesquite tree with care. It was old and gnarled, mostly dead, standing alone on a small rise. It offered no shade. It was a perfect crucifix for their savage sermon. They stretched his arms high, pulling his shoulders until the joints screamed in protest. They wrapped the wet rawhide strips around his wrists and ankles, binding him tight to the rough bark. As the sun baked the strips, they would shrink, constricting like iron bands, cutting off circulation and biting into his flesh. It was a death designed by patient cruelty. The coyotes will start with your feet tonight, Cain had said, his face inches from Taza's. The buzzards will be bolder tomorrow. By the 3rd day, maybe a mountain cat will get curious. Let's see what your spirits do for you now, brave. Then they had ridden off, leaving Taza to his fate. That was 2 days ago. The first day had been about enduring the sun. Taza had retreated deep within himself, to the place of chance, and memories, the place where the body's pain could be muted by the strength of the spirit. He thought of his wife, Nalin, and the face of his young son, Chi. He focused on their faces, letting them become his world a shield against the inferno. The first night brought a cold that was almost as vicious as the heat. The desert having absorbed the sun's fury all day, gave it all back to the endless, starry sky, leaving the ground frigid. His muscles locked in place, cramped violently. The sounds began then, the high, yipping laughter of a coyote pack, circling just beyond the reach of his sight. They were cautious, testing their calls a promise of the horrors to come. He could smell them on the wind, their wild, musky scent, a primal declaration of intent. He remained still a statue of defiance, and they eventually moved on, seeking easier prey. The second day, the thirst became a living entity. It was a demon clawing at his throat, a rasp sanding the inside of his mouth. His tongue was a swollen wooden thing in his mouth. Delirium began to fray the edges of his consciousness. The shimmering heat waves coalesced into figures, ancestors walking the desert floor, beckoning to him. Vultures, no longer patient specks in the sky, began to land on the branches of a nearby saguaro, their bald, wrinkled heads cocked as they watched him with black, unblinking eyes. They were waiting for his head to droop for the last sign of resistance to fade. He fought to keep his head up, to look at them, to let them know he was still a man, not yet meat. But his strength was a leaking vessel. The rawhide had cut deep into his wrists, and the blood long since dried had attracted flies that buzzed in a maddening, persistent cloud around his face. As the sun of the second day began its slow, merciless descent, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple, a new sound reached him. It was not the yip of a coyote or the whisper of the wind. It was the soft, rhythmic footfall of a predator, a different kind of predator. Low to the ground, deliberate, silent. Taza's head snapped up a final surge of adrenaline, cutting through the fog of his pain. His eyes, though swollen, scanned the rocks and creosote bushes at the base of the rise. He saw it then, a flicker of tawny movement. Then the whole animal, a mountain lion, sleek and powerful, its long tail twitching almost imperceptibly. It was downwind, and it had caught his scent, the scent of blood and slow death. The great cat was in no hurry. It began a wide, patient circle, its belly low to the ground, yellow eyes fixed on him. This was it. The beast Cain had promised. Taza closed his eyes for a moment, not in surrender, but in a final, silent prayer. He had fought. He had endured. He would meet his end, facing his killer. He opened his eyes again, staring directly at the cougar as it crouched its powerful haunches, bunching, preparing for the final rush. And then, from the west, came a sound that did not belong, the sharp, clean crack of a Winchester rifle. The sound echoed through the twilight silence, a definitive man-made intrusion into the desert's ancient ritual of death. For a split second, Taza thought Cain had returned to finish the job, but the mountain lion which had been about to spring convulsed violently. It leapt straight into the air, a strangled cry catching in its throat, and then collapsed onto its side, a dark stain spreading rapidly on its tawny flank. It kicked for a few moments, and then was still. Silence descended again, deeper and more profound than before. Taza's mind, reeling from pain and dehydration, struggled to process what had happened. He looked in the direction the shot had come, from a rocky outcrop about 200 yards away. For a long time there was nothing. Then a figure rose from behind the rocks. It was not Cain. It was not one of his men. The silhouette was slender, wearing not buckskin trousers, but a long, practical calico skirt. It was a woman. Johanna Cole knew the sound of death. She had heard it in the quiet rattle of her father's last breath, lost to lung fever back in Ohio. She had heard it in the wet, sickening cough of a calf with black leg. And she had heard it most terribly in the sudden, shocking silence that followed the volley of arrows that had killed her husband Jedediah 2 years prior. That memory was a wound that never scarred over. It was why she lived alone now, in a small, defensible, sodden timber cabin on the banks of Bitter Creek, a place most folks considered the ragged edge of nowhere. Jedediah had built it with his own 2 hands, believing in the promise of the land. He'd seen rolling pastures where others saw scrub and rock. After his death, Johanna had been advised to sell up to go back east, or move into the relative safety of Dust Devil Gulch. She had refused. Leaving the homestead would feel like letting Jedediah die a second time. So she stayed. She became as tough and resilient as the desert itself. She learned to read the sky for rain, the ground for tracks, and the hearts of men for trouble. Her constant companion was the Winchester Model 1873 her husband had given her. She could shoot the eye out of a jackrabbit at 50 yards and drop a deer at 200. The rifle wasn't a tool, it was an extension of her will to survive. She had been tracking a small buck for the better part of the day. Meat was getting low, and the jerky she made from the venison would have to last her through the lean weeks ahead. The tracks had led her further west than she normally ventured into the broken country that bordered Cain's vast cattle range. She had no love for Cain. He was a bully who saw every small homesteader as an obstacle and every Apache as a target for extermination. It was rumored that the raid that had killed her husband and 2 other prospectors hadn't been a random act of savagery. The older, wiser folks in town whispered that someone had provoked the Apache, perhaps by encroaching on sacred ground. Whispers often followed Cain. She was hunkered down behind a weathered granite outcrop, sighting the buck as it drank from a seep when she first saw him. At first he was just a smudge against the landscape, a dark shape where one shouldn't be. Curiosity piqued, she raised her husband's old spyglass. The image swam into focus, and a cold knot formed in her stomach. A man, tied to a tree. An Indian. Her first reaction was a surge of cold, satisfying vindication, an eye for an eye. This was justice for Jedediah. Her hand, steady as a rock, moments before began to tremble. The face of her husband swam before her eyes, his wide, hopeful smile, the way his hair fell across his brow when he was working. He'd been a good man, a kind man. He had been butchered, and the men who did it looked just like the man tied to that tree. She lowered the spyglass, her heart hammering against her ribs. She should turn around. Go home. Forget what she saw. It wasn't her business. This was Cain's land, and this was likely Cain's justice. Getting involved was asking for a world of trouble she couldn't handle. She told herself this over and over. It was the sensible thing, the safe thing. The buck, startled by some scent on the wind, bounded away, forgotten. But she couldn't leave. Something held her there, a stubborn refusal to be what Cain and his men were. She watched through the spyglass as the sun beat down on the captive. She saw his head droop, then snap back up with a visible effort of will. He was still fighting. Despite the horror of his situation, there was a dignity in his defiance that pricked at her conscience. Jedediah had been a man of faith. He read from the Bible every night, his voice a low rumble in their small cabin. He'd spoken often of mercy, of a justice that was higher than man's vengeance. "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord," he would quote. She had found little comfort in those words after he was gone, but seeing this slow, deliberate execution, she understood them a little better. What Cain had done here wasn't justice. It was an abomination. She stayed hidden, a prisoner of her own indecision, as the day bled into evening. The light softened, turning the desert from a hostile glare to a place of deep, mysterious shadows. The air cooled, and then she saw the mountain lion. The animal moved with a liquid grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. Johanna had seen what a cougar could do to a full-grown steer. A weakened, immobile man would stand no chance. She watched it stalk her breath held tight in her chest. She saw it crouch, the muscles in its back legs coiling like powerful springs. Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Let it happen. Let the cat serve the final justice for Jedediah. It's the way of the wild. But then she saw the man tied to the tree lift his head and stare unflinching at the beast. He was going to die, and he was choosing to face it with his eyes open. In that moment, he ceased to be a faceless Apache savage, the spectre that haunted her nightmares. He was just a man about to be torn apart. The teachings of her husband, the deep-seated humanity she had tried so hard to bury under layers of grief and anger, rose to the surface. She couldn't watch it. She couldn't be a party to it, even in her inaction. Without allowing herself a second thought, she raised the Winchester to her shoulder. The stock felt cool and familiar against her cheek. She aligned the sights on the cougar's chest, leading it just a fraction. She exhaled slowly, calming her racing heart, and gently squeezed the trigger. The shot was clean. The echo rolled away into the vast emptiness. She watched the figure at the tree. He was looking her way. She had saved his life from the cat, but she had left him tied to the tree, still sentenced to die from thirst or another predator. She had only postponed his death, not prevented it. "Damn it all to hell, Jedediah," she whispered into the twilight. "What have I done?" Slowly, cautiously, she stood up from behind the rocks. She held the rifle ready, not knowing what to expect. This man was Apache. He was the enemy, but she had interfered. She had cast her lot. Now she had to see it through. Her feet, seemingly of their own accord, began to carry her down the rocky slope and across the open ground toward the lone mesquite tree. Taza watched the woman approach his mind, struggling to grasp the reality of it. The world had turned into a fever dream, and this woman with a rifle seemed no more or less real than the ancestral spirits he had seen walking in the heat haze. She moved with a purpose that belied the caution in her steps, her long skirt kicking up little puffs of dust. She was a white woman, a Inda Likaida, and his people's history with them was written in blood and broken treaties. Why? Why would she kill the cat only to approach him now? Was this some new, crueler game? Johanna's heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Every step closer was a step further away from the simple, lonely life she had carved out for herself. She was walking toward a man who, for all she knew, might have been part of the very war party that killed her husband. The thought sent a jolt of icy fear through her, and her finger tightened on the trigger of the Winchester. She stopped about 20 feet away, keeping a safe distance. She could see him clearly now. He was tall and powerfully built, though gaunt from his ordeal. His face was a mask of dried blood dust and grim determination. His black eyes, sunk deep in their sockets, followed her every move. They held no gratitude, only a burning, wary intensity. There was no plea for help, no sign of weakness. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said, her voice sounding thin and reedy in the vast silence. Taza did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. It was not the sneering condescension of Cain or the nervous fear of a lost settler. It was something else. A statement. He remained silent, his gaze unwavering. Johanna took another hesitant step forward. She could see the rawhide now, how it had dug into his flesh, the skin around it, swollen and purple. It was a ghastly sight. The smell of stale blood and sweat hit her, and she had to fight the urge to gag. My God, she whispered more to herself than to him. This was a test from God, from the devil, from the desert itself. She could turn around right now. She had killed the cougar. Her conscience was assuaged on that point. She could leave him, and no one would ever know she had been here. But she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that if she walked away now, the ghost of this man would haunt her just as surely as Jedediah's memory did. She lowered the rifle slightly, a gesture of non-aggression. With her free hand, she unhooked the canteen from her belt. It was still half full. She took a step closer, then another, until she was just out of arm's reach. She held out the canteen. Tarza's eyes flickered from her face to the canteen and back again. Water. The offer was life itself. But trust was a currency he did not possess. He had seen white men offer food and water before, only to pull a hidden pistol. He stared at her, trying to read her intent, to see past the pale skin and strange clothes to the spirit within. He saw no deceit in her eyes. What he saw was a deep, weary sadness, a sorrow that seemed to mirror his own. And something else, a flicker of fear. She was afraid of him. That more than anything convinced him this was no trap. A trapper does not fear the snare. Slowly, deliberately, he gave a slight nod. Johanna's breath escaped in a shaky sigh of relief. She moved forward and held the canteen to his lips. He drank at first in desperate, choking gulps, then more slowly with controlled discipline. He didn't drain it, leaving some for her, an act of courtesy so unexpected it caught her completely off guard. He pulled his head back, and a single drop of water traced a clean path through the grime on his cheek. Now came the harder part. She slung the rifle over her shoulder and pulled the heavy skinning knife from the sheath on her belt. Tarza's body went rigid. His eyes narrowed, the flicker of trust instantly extinguished, replaced by a cold, hard glare. The knife. This was the trick. The water was to soften him, the knife to finish the job Cain had started. He braced himself, every muscle tensing for a final, futile struggle. Johanna saw the change in him and froze. "Easy," she said softly, holding the knife up. Blade pointed away from him. "I'm cutting you loose." She gestured with the knife toward the rawhide bonds on his wrists. "The ropes. See." He didn't understand her words, but he understood the gesture. Still, he did not relax. He watched her, his eyes like chips of obsidian, as she stepped behind the tree, putting herself out of his immediate reach. It was a smart move, and he respected it. She began to saw at the thick, hardened rawhide on his right wrist. The work was brutally difficult. The strips were as hard as wood, and the angle was awkward. Her knuckles scraped against the rough bark. The man, the Apache, remained utterly still, but she could feel the tension radiating from him, the coiled energy of a predator in a cage. She focused on the task, her world shrinking to the blade, the rawhide, and the sound of her own ragged breathing. Finally, with a groan of protest, the first bond parted. Tarza's right arm fell limply to his side, useless and numb. Without a word, Johanna moved to the other side. The second bond was quicker to yield. As it snapped, he slumped forward, his full weight held only by the ropes on his ankles. He let out a low, guttural groan, a sound of pure agony, as blood hot and stinging rushed back into his deadened arms. Johanna moved to his feet and quickly cut the last two bonds. Tarza collapsed, folding onto the ground at the base of the tree. He didn't fall so much as crumple his legs, refusing to support him. He lay there for a long moment, breathing heavily, his eyes closed. For the first time, Johanna saw the true extent of his exhaustion. The iron will that had kept him upright for 2 days had finally been released from its duty. She backed away, giving him space, her hand resting on the stock of her rifle. She was acutely aware of her vulnerability. She was alone in the desert, with a freed Apache warrior, a man whose people were at war with hers. She had just given him back his freedom and his strength. She had no idea if he would use it to thank her or to kill her. After a few minutes, he stirred. Using the tree for support, he slowly, painfully pulled himself into a sitting position. He flexed his fingers, his face a tight mask as he worked through the searing pain. Then he looked at her. He raised his right hand, the one she had freed first, and touched his own chest with his fingertips. "Taza," he said. His voice was a dry, cracked whisper, but the name was clear. He had given her his name. It was an offering, a bridge across the vast chasm of hatred and fear that separated their two worlds. Johanna swallowed her throat, suddenly dry. She mirrored his gesture, touching her own chest. "Johanna," she replied. Johanna Cole. The journey back to Bitter Creek was a silent, agonizing trek. Taza's legs were stiff and unsteady, and every step was a fresh torment. Johanna walked a few paces behind him, her Winchester held loosely but ready. The trust between them was a fragile, newborn thing, easily shattered. The desert, now cloaked in the deep indigo of night, was alive with sounds that made her skin crawl. She knew Taza was far more attuned to this world than she was, and she found a strange, reluctant comfort in his presence. He was the enemy, yet he was also the most capable protector she could have asked for. They reached her homestead, just as the first hint of dawn was painting the eastern sky a pale, pearly grey. The cabin was little more than a one-room box of sod and timber, but to Johanna it was a fortress. A thin curl of smoke still rose from the stone chimney, the last embers of her morning fire. Taza stopped at the edge of the small clearing, his eyes scanning the cabin, the small corral with her single mule, the neatly tended vegetable patch. This was her world. It was a world of fences and straight lines, so different from his own. He looked at her, a silent question in his eyes. "It's safe," she said, gesturing for him to come closer. Inside, she lit a kerosene lamp, casting a warm, flickering glow over the simple room. There was a bed in one corner, a stone hearth, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs and shelves holding tins of food and mason jars. On the mantelpiece, next to a worn Bible, was a single, silver-framed photograph. While Johanna busied herself at the hearth, adding wood to the embers and putting a pot of water on to heat, Taza's gaze was drawn to the photograph. It showed a smiling, confident man with kind eyes and a thick mustache, his arm around a younger, happier-looking Johanna. The man was dressed in sturdy work clothes, but he looked directly at the camera with an open, honest expression. Taza limped over to the fireplace, his eyes fixed on the image. He didn't need to be told who this was. This was the man of this house, her man, and he was gone. Taza could feel his absence in the quiet emptiness of the cabin, in the solitary way Johanna moved about her chores. Johanna turned a bowl of hot water and a clean rag in her hands. She saw him looking at the photograph. A familiar pang of grief, sharp and sudden, stabbed at her chest. "My husband," she said softly. "Jedediah." She walked over to him. "You need to clean those wounds." She gestured to his wrists. He looked from the photo to her, then down at his own raw flesh. He gave a curt nod and sat at the table, extending his arms. As she gently cleaned the deep cuts, her touch was professional and detached, like a doctor tending to a patient. But the proximity was unsettling for both of them. For Johanna, his presence filled her small home in a way no one had since Jedediah's death. He was intensely male, exuding a quiet strength that was both intimidating and, to her surprise, faintly reassuring. He smelled of dust, sweat, and something else, something wild and elemental, like the desert itself. For Taza, the gentle touch of this woman was a profound shock. His experience with her kind had been one of violence and betrayal. Cain's men had been rough and brutal. This woman, who had every reason to hate him, was tending to his wounds with a care that spoke of a deep, if buried, compassion. He watched her face in the lamplight. It was a strong face, framed by simple brown hair, tied back in a practical bun. Her eyes, a clear, steady grey, were filled with a sorrow he recognized, for it was the same sorrow he saw in the eyes of the widows in his own camp. Suddenly, Taza spoke, his voice still a rasp. "Nakai, yes." He pointed to the photograph of Jedediah, then made a gesture with his hands, mimicking the firing of a bow and arrow. He tapped his own chest. "Chiricahua," he asked. It was a direct, unflinching question. "Was your man killed by my people?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and dangerous. All the fear and anger Johanna had been suppressing rushed back to the surface. She pulled her hands back, as if she'd been burned, her face hardening. "Yes," she said, her voice tight and cold. "A war party. 2 years ago, near the Dragon's Tooth." Taza's expression didn't change, but a deep stillness came over him. The Dragon's Tooth. He knew the place. He had not been there at that time, but he had heard the stories. A group of prospectors, it was said, had been found digging on sacred ground, a burial site of the ancients. The warriors who found them young and hot-headed had acted without the counsel of their elders. A terrible, bloody mistake. He looked at her, then shook his head slowly, a gesture of profound regret. He touched his own chest again. "Not Taza," he said simply and with great gravity. Then he looked at her with an intensity that seemed to bore right through her. He knew this was not enough. The chasm between them was too wide to be bridged by a few words and a gesture. Before Johanna could process this, a new sound cut through the pre-dawn quiet. The distant but distinct sound of horses. Not one or two. Many. And they were coming fast. Johanna's head snapped up, her eyes wide with alarm. She rushed to the window, peering through a small crack in the wooden shutter. A knot of riders was cresting the ridge a half-mile away, dark silhouettes against the growing light. Even at this distance, the lead rider was unmistakable. Cain, she breathed a knot of ice forming in her stomach. It's Dash Cain. Taza was beside her in an instant, his weakness forgotten. He looked out the window, his face grim. He had not expected them to track him here, but he had underestimated the white man's obsessive brand of hatred. Cain wasn't the type to leave a job unfinished. "He saw your tracks from the tree," Johanna said, her mind racing. "He followed them here." She looked around her small cabin, her sanctuary. It had just become a trap. They were cornered. Taza was injured and unarmed. She had her Winchester and a Colt revolver, but there were at least a dozen men out there. Taza looked at her, his eyes asking the question she was asking herself. What now? This woman had saved him from the desert, but in doing so, she had brought Dash Cain's war right to her doorstep. He had brought death to her home, just as her people had brought death to her husband. The irony was as bitter as the creek that gave this place its name. "Get away from the window." Taza's voice was a low growl, shaking Johanna from her frozen panic. He pulled her back, his grip surprisingly strong. The instinct of a warrior who had survived countless ambushes had taken over. The riders were closer now, their hoofbeats, a thunderous drum roll, announcing their arrival. Cain reined in his horse 50 yards from the cabin, his men fanning out behind him in a loose, intimidating semicircle. "Johanna Cole." Cain's voice boomed across the clearing, a sound of arrogant authority. "I know you're in there, and I know who you've got with you. Send out the Apache filth, and no harm will come to you or your property." Johanna's hands were shaking. She looked at Taza. His face was a stone mask, but his eyes were alive, darting around the room, assessing every shadow, every piece of furniture, every possible angle. He was no longer a victim. He was a tactician. "He lies," Tarza said, his gaze meeting hers. "He will burn this place. He will kill us both." She knew he was right. Cain couldn't afford a witness. He couldn't let it be known that he'd left a man to die for a crime he may not have committed, and that a woman had defied him. "I have the rifle," Johanna said, her voice trembling but resolute, "and a revolver. Maybe 40 rounds in total." Tarza nodded, his eyes falling on the fireplace. He pointed to the heavy iron poker resting on the hearth. It wasn't a lance or a bow, but it was steel, and it had weight. He then pointed to her skinning knife, which she'd left on the table. The plan was unspoken, but perfectly clear. This was their ground. They would make it a fortress. "Bar the door," Tarza commanded. Johanna slid the heavy wooden bar into its iron brackets, the sound echoing with finality in the small cabin. "The back window," he asked, pointing to the single small window at the rear of the cabin. "It's shuttered from the outside," she replied. "No way out." They were sealed in. Coal. "I'm not asking again." Cain shouted, his patience wearing thin. One of his men, a lanky cowboy named Bo, nervously shifted in his saddle. Maybe she just found him and felt sorry for him. She's a widow woman after all. She's a traitor. Cain spat his face, purpling with rage. "And I'll see her hang right next to him. Flint, put a round through the door. Let 'em know we mean business." A rifle cracked, and a splinter of wood exploded inward from the door, zinging past Johanna's head and thudding into the far wall. She yelped and dropped to the floor. That was it. The time for talking was over. Johanna crawled to the front window, took a deep breath, and slowly pushed the shutter open, just a crack. She rested the barrel of the Winchester on the sill. She saw Cain on his big roan horse, directing his men. He was making himself a clear target. Her grief, her fear, it all coalesced into a single point of cold, clear rage. This man was the source of it all. He had brought this violence into her world. She centered the rifle's sight on the brass button of his coat. No, Tarza's voice was sharp right beside her ear. He had crawled over to her position. Not the leader. Never the leader first. He pointed with his chin, the men on the sides. "Make them run for cover. Make them afraid. If you kill the leader, the pack scatters. Some run away. Some get more vicious. We need them afraid." His logic was brutal, cold, and flawless. It was the wisdom of 100 desperate fights. Johanna, raised on stories of heroic last stands, had been thinking like a settler. Tarza was thinking like a survivor. She nodded her respect for him, deepening. She shifted her aim to a man on the far left one, who was dismounting to find cover behind a water trough. She took a breath, let it out, and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester bucked against her shoulder. The man screamed and crumpled to the ground, clutching his leg. Chaos erupted among Cain's men. They scrambled for cover, dismounting and diving behind rocks and the small corral fence. They had expected a cowering woman, not disciplined resistance. Good Tarza grunted. He had the fireplace poker in one hand and her knife in the other. Reload. Always reload. Johanna worked the rifle's lever. The familiar shuck-shuck sound, a small comfort. She chambered a new round. The air was now filled with the roar of gunfire. Bullets hammered into the thick sod walls of the cabin, thudding harmlessly for the most part, but the ones that hit the timber frame sent splinters flying. Cain, now behind cover, was screaming orders. "They can't see us well," Tarza observed, his eyes scanning the angles. "We can see them. We stay low, move after every shot." For the next hour, a deadly dance played out. Johanna, guided by Tarza's sharp instructions, became a phantom shooter. She would fire a single careful shot from the front window, then crawl on her belly to a small chink in the side wall and fire again. Tarza acted as her spotter, his keen eyes picking out targets and warning her of flanking movements she couldn't see. He pointed out a man trying to sneak toward the blind side of the cabin. Johanna's next shot kicked up dust right at his feet, sending him scurrying back like a frightened rabbit. They worked together with a synergy that defied the chasm between their cultures. He was the strategist. She was the weapon. He didn't know how to use the rifle, but he knew exactly how it should be deployed. She knew how to shoot, but had never been in a sustained gunfight. Trapped in that small, besieged cabin, they were not White and Apache. They were simply two people fighting to see the next sunrise. A lull fell over the fighting as Cain and his men reconsidered their strategy. The sun was higher now, and the heat was building. "They will try fire," Tarza said, looking up at the timbered roof. "The sod won't burn, but the roof will." Johanna's blood ran cold. The roof was made of dry pine beams and packed earth. If it caught fire, they would be roasted alive or forced out into the open. As if on cue, they heard a new sound, a man shouting from the direction of the corral. "Dash, she's got a barrel of kerosene by the shed." Perfect Cain's voice was triumphant. "Bow flint. Get some rags, we're burning them out." Johanna looked at Tarza, her face pale with dread. "It's over." Tarza's eyes were blazing. He looked at the back window, then at the sturdy wooden table in the center of the room. A desperate, almost insane idea was forming in his mind. "No," he said, his voice a low, determined growl. "Not over." He grabbed the table. "Help me." The table. "What for?" Johanna asked, bewildered, as Tarza grunted with effort, dragging the heavy oak table across the floor. "The window." He gasped the words, punctuated by exertion. "We go out the back. I told you it's shuttered from the outside." "There's a heavy crossbeam." "Good, Tarza," said a grim smile, touching his lips for the first time. He positioned the table directly beneath the small rear window. "Makes a better battering ram." He climbed onto the table, his injured legs protesting, and braced his shoulders against the wall. "The shutter opens out, yes." Johanna nodded her mind, starting to grasp his desperate logic. "They are all at the front and sides waiting for the fire. The back is their blind spot. But not for long." He looked down at her. "When the fire starts, they will watch the front door. They will expect us to run out, choking. That is our chance. We must be fast." Outside, they could hear the men preparing their voices, filled with a cruel, excited energy. The smell of kerosene, sharp and pungent, began to drift on the air. Johanna's home, her last connection to Jedediah, was about to be turned into a funeral pyre. There was no time for grief, only for action. She checked her revolver, ensuring it was fully loaded, and tucked it into her waistband. She grabbed the remaining box of Winchester cartridges and stuffed them into her apron pocket. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steadier now. The terror was still there, a cold stone in her gut, but it was overlaid with a hard, defiant resolve. A flaming torch arced through the air, landing on the roof with a soft thump. A moment later, another followed. A sickly orange glow began to filter through the cracks in the ceiling, and the smell of burning pine filled the cabin. Now Cain roared from outside. "Let's see you dance, you devils!" The heat inside the cabin intensified almost immediately. Smoke thick and acrid began to sting their eyes and claw at their throats. Ready Tarza called down to her. Johanna gave him a determined nod, pulling the bottom of her skirt over her mouth and nose. Tarza took a deep breath, braced himself, and then threw his entire body weight backward against the window. The small wooden frame groaned in protest. He slammed against it again. A crack appeared. On the third powerful shove, the interior frame splintered and broke. Now only the exterior shutter and its crossbeam remained. He rearranged himself, turning, so he could use his legs. He planted his feet on the interior wall and kicked backward with all the strength he could muster. The first kick made the whole wall shudder. The second, fueled by desperation, was a massive blow. With a loud crack, the exterior crossbeam split. The shutters burst outward, swinging violently on their leather hinges. For a moment, a perfect square of clean, smoke-free air was framed before them. "Freedom!" Taza yelled, scrambling through the opening. He landed awkwardly on the ground, outside his legs, nearly buckling, but he recovered instantly. Johanna passed the Winchester out to him, and then clambered through herself, her dress snagging on the broken frame. She ripped it free and dropped to the ground beside him. The scene behind the cabin was strangely peaceful. The gunfire had stopped. All the attention was on the front of the house, which was now beginning to billow black smoke. The crackle of the flames was growing louder. They could hear the whoops and hollers of Cain's men as they celebrated their victory. Taza didn't hesitate. He grabbed Johanna's arm and pulled her low, scurrying toward the cover of the thick brush that lined the banks of Bitter Creek. They moved with a desperate urgency, half crawling, half running, until they were 20 yards away, concealed in a thicket of willow and cottonwood. From their hiding place, they watched as the roof of the cabin began to sag. The flames grew, licking hungrily at the sky. Cain and his men were silhouetted against the blaze, their faces lit by the destructive orange light, confident that their enemies were perishing within. A terrible, wrenching sob escaped Johanna's throat. Everything she had, everything Jedediah had built, was turning to ash. All her memories, the photograph, the Bible, all of it gone. Taza put a hand on her shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of comfort, not in the way a white man would offer it. It was a gesture of solidarity, a silent acknowledgement of her loss. His face was grim. He understood at this kind of destruction. He had seen his own people's wiki-ups, burned their lives, erased by fire. "We are not dead," he whispered, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "As long as we are not dead, we can fight." His words, simple and stark, cut through her grief. He was right. They had taken her home. She would not let them take her life. She wiped the tears and soot from her face with the back of her hand, her expression hardening. They watched as Cain's men grew impatient, waiting for the screams that never came. "They ain't coming out, Flint," said nervousness creeping into his voice. "You think they're all ready?" Maybe Cain grunted, staring at the inferno. Or maybe they're just stubborn. No one could survive that. He was about to turn and give the order to leave when Bo, who had wandered toward the back of the cabin to relieve himself, let out a yell. Dash. The back windows broken out. Their tracks. They lead to the creek, Cain's face contorted in a mask of pure fury. "Spread out," he bellowed. "Find them. I want that Apache's scalp, and I want her head on a pike." No witnesses. His men, now spooked and angry at being duped, plunged into the brush along the creek. But Taza and Johanna were already gone. Guided by Taza's knowledge of the land, they were moving swiftly and silently downstream, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the burning ruin of the homestead. The hunt had begun. But now the prey were not trapped. They were in their element. Taza was a ghost in the wilderness, and he had a woman with a Winchester by his side. Cain thought he was the hunter, but as the sun set on the smouldering remains of the cabin, the roles were beginning to reverse. For 2 days they were phantoms in the wilderness, Taza's skills keeping them ahead of Cain's posse. From a high ridge they watched Cain and his remaining men ride hard for Dust Devil Gulch. "He goes for more men," Taza said, his voice a low rasp. "He will name you a traitor and raise a posse to hunt us down." Johanna knew he was right. They couldn't outrun Cain's influence forever. "So what do we do?" Tazar's gaze was fixed on a distant scar in the earth to the north. The men I was tracking, the real horse thieves. They are white men. Their camp is in Coyote Jaw Canyon. The stolen mares are with them. The truth is with them. A desperate, dangerous plan ignited in Johanna's mind. It wasn't enough to run. They had to fight back, not with bullets, but with truth. They reached the canyon rim and peered down. 3 rough-looking outlaws were camped below, and in a rope corral were Tazar's tribal mares. The element of surprise was their only advantage. Tazar picked up a rock. "I will make them look," he whispered. "You will make them fall." He hurled the stone, and it clattered on the far side of the canyon. As the outlaws spun towards the sound, Johanna's Winchester spoke. The first man dropped. The second clutched his chest and fell. The third dove for cover behind the panicked horses, firing his pistol wildly. Before Johanna could get a clear shot, Tazar was over the edge, sliding down the scree slope with the speed of a striking snake. The outlaw barely had time to turn before Tazar was upon him. The fight was swift, brutal, and silent. When the dust settled, Tazar calmly walked over to the body of the first man Johanna had shot. From his saddlebag, he pulled a worn leather wallet. He looked at it for a moment before handing it up to her. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Stamped inside was the name Jedediah Cole. The world tilted. The men who killed her husband were not Apache. They were these men, white outlaws, whose crime Cain had conveniently pinned on the nearest Indian. The hatred she had carried for 2 years had been aimed at the wrong people. An hour later, they rode into Dust Devil Gulch, the recovered mares in tow. Townsfolk stared as the unlikely pair, the soot-stained widow and the proud Apache warrior, halted in the middle of the street. At the far end, Cain was rallying his posse. He turned his face, contorting with rage as he saw them. "There they are," he roared. "The murderer and his whore. You are the liar." Johanna's voice rang out clear and strong as she held up the wallet. "This was my husband's. I took it from the white outlaw who truly killed him, the man you were too full of hate to even look for. This Apache is an innocent man. You sentenced to die to satisfy your own bigotry." A murmur of doubt rippled through the crowd. Cain, seeing his authority crumbling, made his final desperate play. He drew his Colt peacemaker. "She's lying, kill them," but his fate was already sealed. As his pistol came up, Tazar let out a war cry and charged forward, a startling distraction. Cain fired wildly, his shot going high. In that split second of hesitation, Johanna's rifle cracked one last time. Cain staggered, a look of profound surprise on his face, before collapsing into the dust of the street he thought he owned. His men leaderless, and facing a town that had seen the truth, simply faded away. In the sudden silence, Tazar reined in his horse. He looked at Johanna, a universe of understanding passing between them in a single silent gaze. He gave a slow, solemn nod of respect. Then, gathering the leads of his mares, he turned his horse and rode east, a free man returning to his people, leaving Johanna Cole to stand tall in the quiet street, her husband's memory finally at peace, and her own justice finally won. In the unforgiving wilderness of the Old West, stories weren't always written by the victors, but by the survivors. The tale of Johanna Cole and the Apache warrior Tazar isn't just a story of a bullet saving a life. It's a testament to the fact that our shared humanity can at times be stronger than our learned hatreds. It's a story about how the deepest wounds aren't always inflicted by our enemies, but by the lies we tell ourselves about them. In a world of black and white, they found a grey space in the dust and smoke, a place where justice had to be forged by hand, by two people who had every reason to be enemies, but chose to be allies instead. If this story of grit survival and unexpected redemption resonated with you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with someone who appreciates a real story of the West. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more tales from the frontier where history is raw and legends are born from the dust. Thank you for listening.